the first garment I'm going to show you how to get the pattern from is just a simple basic t-shirt. I know we all have those t-shirts that we just wear time and time again because we just like the fit. You know, it drapes in a certain way and it's not too tight, not too loose, and you have a lot of t-shirts, but you always go back to wearing, you know, that same one, and now you can just simply make it up again in different, you know, jerseys and fabrics. I know this is actually one of my favorite t-shirts, and so I decided I use this so I would have the pattern for myself. So what you need to do is lay your large piece of paper on your drafting or cutting table. So I just have this sort of paper around. It's just a large sheet of craft paper, sort of that brown craft paper, or you can use that sort of gridded, dotted pattern paper as well. That works. And this is the tracing wheel method. I really like this method. So the first thing that you're going to do is just take your hands and simply at the top and at the bottom of the garment, just grab where the side seams are. So you want the side seam, you can kind of see it a little bit. That's the side seam. You want it right at the edge. And then I just grab those two and I just shake the garment. You want to kind of shake out all the wrinkles. So I just take those two there and then shake it and then kind of slap it on the table and the pattern paper so it's like really flat. And so as you can see now it's really flat. And then what I'm going to do is actually take some pins and pin my garment super flat to the paper. So, and then I'm just also making sure that my seam is actually not, you know, sometimes when you lay it down the seam could be, you know, twisted if the garment you know, has been worn a lot and washed, the seam could be warped a little bit. And so just make sure it's not, no part of the seam is sort of folded under and actually at the back. So just double check, you know, pat it down with your hands and smooth it out and just put some pins in the garment. And you want to make sure, especially when you're copying a t-shirt or a garment made out of a knit fabric, that you're not stretching it. You just sort of want it to lay as it is. So don't, you know, like stretch this down or stretch this out. Just make sure it lays flat or else you'll get an inaccurate pattern. And then what we're going to do is actually to, you know, make a little less work for ourselves, we're just going to copy half of the garment because, you know, it's symmetrical, so we can just sort of draft half and then perfect that half and then, you know, retrace the other half. So what I do first off is find the middle of the shirt. So I just take my tape measure and I measure from, you know, underarm point to underarm point and put a pin, you know, in that center measurement. And I continue doing that, you know, at points all throughout my t-shirt. So I do it right at the top, underarm, you know, waist, and then hem. And now that your garment is all laid flat and you've established, you know, your center front, center back line, then we can start to trace around the edges. One of the methods was you simply trace around these edges in like pen or pencil, but I don't like to do that in case, you know, I get some on my garment. So I just simply take a tracing wheel and apply, you know, a decent amount of pressure so you can see those, you know, punctured holes, and just simply trace around half of the garment with the tracing wheel. So I'll take my tracing wheel and I go along the hemline to where about, you know, that pin line is in my center front, and then I'll go up the side seam and then my shoulder seam. And then here is where I also like the tracing wheel method because I can sort of go into the garment, and you couldn't do that with a pencil. You couldn't get this, you know, front neckline shape with using a pencil. So when you put the pressure on the tracing wheel, it punctures and shows the markings in the fabric. So just trace down, you know, the center front neckline. You only need to go to where the pin marks are again because we're only doing half. And then you want to make sure you trace the back neckline as well, and then down the center front. What I also did, and I suggest you doing, is unless you're going to put like a lot of pins in, I would actually hold up a ruler and sort of connect, you know, the top one to the bottom one and use the tracing wheel along the ruler, so you're not just guessing, you know, that line in between the distances of the pins. So just put a ruler so all the pins align, and so you really know that you're getting that straight center front line. And then another great thing about the tracing wheel is you can trace the armhole shape really easily. You simply just take your tracing wheel and go along the armhole line. And so you don't want to just trace the sleeve from here, because in order to get the shirt flat, the sleeve needs to sort of curl a little bit, and you won't get an accurate sleeve reading if that's curled. So do the top first, and then sort of unpin your garment, and then repin the sleeve. So I've sort of stretched out the sleeve, and see I have some sort of, not gathers, but folds in my t-shirt, and so my sleeve can lay flat. So I've just pinned my sleeve, and I've actually moved onto another, section of my back paper, so they're not right on top of each other, so I can, isolate them better. So I've unpinned my garment, shifted it over like, 10 inches or so from my tracing that I did for my top, and now I'm just going to trace my sleeve. So I just, trace down that same armhole edge, but it's actually going to be, the sleeve, crown and shaping, and then you trace down here, and then these lines as well, just trace around those. And then for a simple t-shirt, that's really all you need to do, is just those simple things. And for the pocket, that actually, it's easier just to, I'll show you later, just to take your measuring tape and just measure it and draft it from the measurements. You don't need to trace it, because it's just simply a square, and obviously, it's out of fabric and it's been worn, so it might, be warped a little bit. So we'll draft that later. And so now you unpin your garment, and as you can see on your paper, these tracing lines are quite visible, depending also on the pressure. I find you need to apply a lot more pressure when you're, for this line right here, the sleeve line, because you're going through, layers of fabric. It's not just on the paper. So make sure you press quite hard when you're doing, style lines or anything internally in the garment where you're going through the fabric as well. So remove shirt from the paper to reveal your tracing wheel marks. So you'll get sort of this. This is the sleeve, and then this is sort of, it's hard to see in the picture, but in real life, in real life, you can see it a lot better. And so now we have those tracing wheel marks, and we need to actually join all of them and sort of perfect them. So I just take my ruler and sort of draw over the tracing wheel lines that I had. So I usually do center front first, and sometimes it's a little off because it's hard, with the tracing wheel to get a perfectly straight line. So I take my longest ruler and I mark it at where my top mark is, wherever my center front line hit, wherever my neckline was, and then I connect it to where my center front line hits my hemline, and I just draw a line. I don't worry about the inside. They were honestly just about like 1/8 of an inch off, which is totally fine. So just take those 2 points and connect them in a straight line. And same with the shoulder, but the shoulder was pretty straight because it's a shorter line, so it's easier to sort of get it accurate. And so as you can see now, I've just dashed my lines from my side seam and my hem and up my center front, and I've drawn in my armhole and my back and front neckline. And so now what you need to do is actually turn the garment inside out, because now we need to sort of build our seam allowance, and in order to, get a fit, we need to sort of measure what seam allowances they used on the garment to sew it in the first place, and then we sort of build that onto our pattern. So what I did is I just flipped it out and measured, they just serged it together, and I measured their width, so it's 1/4 of an inch that I added to all the edges, and then the hem, they added about 5/8 of an inch, so I'll add that to the hem of my garment. Obviously you can change it to whatever hem or seam finish you want. Just make sure you build the appropriate seam allowance and sew true to that, or else you're going to get an inaccurate fit. So I've just built my seam allowance on my shoulder, armhole, side seam, and then my hem allowance as well. And I didn't add any on my necklines because I looked at my garment and there's binding, so I didn't need to add any onto that. But if you were gonna, draft a separate band, or you wanted to do like a collarette finish on it, you would add some allowance to it. So you have still a bit of freedom. You're not, totally limited to whatever the garment is, obviously. So here's just another view of where, I don't have any on my necklines, and then I just label them. This is my center front and center back. So this is obviously, this is what I would like to call, you know, a master draft. And if I were to actually sew this garment, I would, you know, place tracing paper over top and trace off the front. So I would trace off just the front neckline and everything else, and then I would do a separate one for the back. And so I'd have two separate ones, both identical, but with just different necklines. You could also just cut it, you know, just cut your pattern first in using your center back line, and then simply cut into the pattern for center front, and then, but you couldn't reuse this pattern. You'd need to do a separate trace off with both necklines. So there's a bunch of options that you can do. And so now let's get to the sleeve. So for the sleeve, you know, center fold line where it kind of lines up with the shoulder seam, I just drew a straight line. It was a bit curved from when I traced it, and so I just took where it was at the top crown and the hem, and I connected those with a straight point. And then I drew in my hemline. I didn't add any hem allowance because I looked at my garment and there wasn't any, and so that was sort of the finishing detail of the t-shirt, so I left it off. You could add it if you wanted to have a different hem finish on your shirt, and then add the seam allowances for the crown and the side seam of the t-shirt. So. And then what you actually need to do here, sorry, I'll go back, is you need to sort of take this now and walk it back. Like I would actually not walk it because they're not cut out yet, but what you can do is actually take your tape measure and measure the distance from here, you know, down to underarm point, and measure your pattern and see if those measurements are the same. They should be pretty relative. Maybe, you know, you can account for maybe, you know, 1/8 of an inch to anywhere from 1/2 inch off, and so you just make necessary adjustments. So you don't just simply trace out the pattern and it's final. You need to sort of double check and make sure things that are supposed to be sewn together are actually the same measurement. But they usually are pretty close. There's just always minor adjustments in my history of doing this. And so what I've done now is, to get the full pattern, I've just folded my pattern paper in half along that center front, center back line, and I just cut it out while it's folded so I can get the exact same shape with the seam allowance added on the other side, so I have a full pattern. And then I just took my tracing wheel again and retraced my center front line so I can get it on the other side of my pattern, as you can see, and I just redrew that on my other half of my pattern. So now I have my full t-shirt layout pattern.